All right, welcome to Racket News. And can everybody hear me correctly? Since I'm so bad, I'm such a Luddite with audio and all these things, I just want to make sure that everybody can actually hear what I'm saying before I continue forward. All right, people hear me. Terrific. You're going to hear a soda also, and then we're going to begin. So thank you everybody for coming out. I've been working a while on this story. Let me preface this by saying I hate election interference stories. I never do them. I've been rejecting them for over 20 years now. The reason for that has always been that, well, there's been several reasons. Number one, they're very tough to prove. Number two, the laws for every state are labyrinthine, difficult to learn, and you have to make a massive investment of time and effort to make any sense of whether or not the claims that you're hearing are legitimate or not. So, in the many years that I've been reporting, I've been pitched a lot of election interference stories, and I've always kind of begged out of them, dating back to 2004, dating back to the years when Greg Palast was trying to say that the election had been stolen from George Bush. I had people from the Sanders campaign pitch me on a theory that one of the primaries had been stolen. So I try to stay away from these stories, but this one is something that I think it's reached to the point now where the question of whether or not America's elections are actually even in the ballpark of fair and square, I think is now the number one issue in the 2024 election season. And then that's not just involving Donald Trump. We're looking at a whole constellation of stories. If you read the story that I published today about the fix being in, we're talking not just about the lawsuits to get Donald Trump off the ballot in Colorado, the complaint that led to the similar decision in Maine, the series of lawsuits that are still in the works that are largely backed by Crew, which used to be actually a little bit of a bipartisan organization, but then they were taken over by David Brock and turned into essentially a lawfare group. That's only part of the story, though. The efforts to try to keep Donald Trump off the ballot. We also have the remarkable, I think, historical efforts to disable completely the intramural competition within the Democratic Party. And then after that, we have the ongoing and I think remarkable story about the effort to try to disenfranchise the third-party efforts, not only of No Labels and of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which might end up being the same thing in some cases. It depends. But I'm sorry, someone is saying that the Rumble link in my announcement is going to one of the Substack articles. So let me ask my assistant to fix that. Hang on a moment, folks. So while I do that, the idea of this broadcast is to go through in more detail the stuff that I had to leave out in analyzing the Transition Integrity Project document that actually came out 3 years ago. It has new significance because there was a recent news story in the NBC that suggested that something almost exactly similar was now underway, a loose-knit group led by Protect Democracy that was examining scenarios for what happens if Donald Trump gives a crazy order or refuses to go abide by the law. Let's wargame that. So I look back at the TIP. Now, a lot of people think that the TIP is significant because it's evidence of a literal plot to overturn a legal Donald Trump election. But when I read it, what I found, what is I think more significant, it's really like psychological projection. It's a list of what 100 prominent people, including the likes of John Podesta, Donna Brazile, Jennifer Granholm, a whole series of lawyers, a couple of generals, and people like Norm Eisen, who is the former chief ethics lawyer under Barack Obama, that when they were listing the theoretical abuses that Donald Trump might commit in the Transition Integrity Project, it sounded suspiciously like a catalog of the things that they themselves had done, or that people, Democratic Party surrogates had done since the beginning of the Donald Trump administration. So I only gave a couple of examples in the piece, but there are many more that I think are worth going through. And there's also some other details that lead to some other rabbit holes that you might find interesting if this is a subject that you care about. So, all right. So let's go to the document, which is called Preventing a Disrupted Presidential Election and Transition. And if you have not read this document, I highly recommend that you do so. There's a link to it in the piece today. Its release was accidental, as it turned out. They never meant to actually release anything at all. There was a massive public relations campaign in June and July of 2020 about the Transition Integrity Project. If you read the piece, you saw a little montage of just some of the headlines, but there were upwards of 20 or 30 stories about this group. There ended up being more, but what happened was that there was one particular story written by Ben Smith that included a detail that nobody wanted to get out, which is that John Podesta, who was playing Joe Biden in this election simulation that they were doing in this group, that in a scenario that involved a clear Trump win, and I'll show this to you in a moment, that he ended up threatening secession of 3 Western states that he called Cascadia, and did so in rather than accede to the idea of a new Trump election. And this detail was leaked out, obviously, and it was a big deal in the conservative media because sort of evidence of Hillary Clinton's former campaign chief had made a move to violate the law, even hypothetically not following the results of a legal election. It was a bad look. I think maybe more was made of it than was necessary at the time, that particular detail. But because there was all this speculation and there was so much rancor about that one incident, it was decided to release a report. So this you can see here, August 3rd, 2020. That's the day after the Ben Smith article. So we can assume that this was probably written because this is a pretty considerable document. I don't think they wrote this overnight. But in any case, it's a long report that contains a variety of scenarios and a variety of thoughts and recommendations about what to do in a contested election scenario. Now, they talk about, here, just even at the start, I should have highlighted this and did not. Throughout this report, the authors of the tip, and the tip included both Republicans and Democrats. Again, it had people like Podesta and Brazil on one side, but it also had Michael Steele, Bill Kristol, David Frum, a number of sort of nominally Republican folk. There are some people who are not confirmed to have participated in this exercise, but who are suspected of having participated. And they are Republicans, but they're all of the kind of never Trump Republican sort. So even though it is a bipartisan exercise, it's bipartisan sort of nominally, I would say. But they made pretenses to saying that they were looking at this fairly, that they were, not looking at it one way or the other. But they kept saying things like this. We also assess that President Trump is likely to contest the result by both legal and extra-legal means in an attempt to hold on to power. And they go on to say over and over again, we're being fair, but we think it's Trump who's going to violate the rules. So that's worth noting. Going on. This is key, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote the companion piece about Ralph Nader. That and the fact that once I started looking at the Nader cases, I realized that they were clearly part of the intellectual background for a lot of these techniques. But the TIP authors write, in this report, TIP explains the basis for our assessment. Our findings are bolstered by the historical experience of Bush v. Gore 2000 and other U.S. electoral dysfunctions. So this is something that if you talk to people about this exercise from both the Democratic and the Republican side, they'll bring this up, that for lack of a better word, the Democrats are still not over what happened in 2000. The results of the 2000 election led to a sort of massive, what's the best way to put it? A radicalizing of the left liberal media space. So these, so you had all of these sort of venerable liberal organizations like the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, Public Citizen, which of course is actually originally founded by Ralph Nader. They were issue-oriented. They had won significant victories about things like integrating the workplace and housing discrimination, auto safety, all kinds of things. But they had a reputation for not being so great at the business of getting Democrats elected. And so after 2000 especially, there began to be this process of transforming the these old issue-oriented organizations into what you might currently call lawfare organizations that just exist to do one thing. It's an asymmetrical form of electoral combat. Lawfare is a term that was originally coined by an Air Force general named Charlie Dunlap. I reached out to him for this story as well. His original definition of lawfare was essentially a technique in place of combat, the use of law as a substitute for military action. It had until about 15 years ago, a universally negative connotation among American commentators. It was usually used to describe something that would be done by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or Hamas. And the usual idea was that one of these groups would appeal to or would file a complaint. The Wall Street Journal has an article about this simply called lawfare, that talks about the filing of usually meritless human rights complaints to prevent America from using its technological and military superiority, and to arouse global sympathy for the victims of civilian bombings and that sort of thing. So that's what lawfare was up until about 2010. Now, I talked to the authors of that Wall Street Journal lawfare article, and they, here it is, actually. All right, David Rifkin and Lee Casey, and they talked about the fact that yes, we have a new definition for lawfare now that doesn't mean what it meant back in the day. And as everybody knows, there's a site that's called lawfare. Lawfare has this positive connotation. It sort of suggests somebody who's willing to go the extra mile to get somebody elected. Now, it's relevant particularly to this story because the group actually that did the tip simulation was profiled in Time magazine, and as you can see, they talked about the title of the article was Trench Lawfare, Inside the Battles to Save Democracy from the Trump Administration. And this article talked about the cooperation of the group, the umbrella group that started the Transition Integrity Project, Protect Democracy, their cooperation with the actual site lawfare. In that particular instance, I think it was to obtain the so-called Watergate playbook, which was the prosecutorial playbook for going after Nixon that was never actually employed. Anyway, the whole point is trench lawfare, this concept of, coloring outside the lines to win, using asymmetrical means to win an election. That's what this means now. And it's now a positive instead of a negative, which is just interesting. It doesn't really mean anything. So anyway, going back to the document. Now we get to some interesting stuff. They write about how the closest analogy to what they were dealing with may be the election of 1876, a time of extreme partisanship and rampant disenfranchisement, where multiple states proffered competing slates of electors, and the election was only resolved through a grand political bargain days before inauguration, one that traded an end to the Reconstruction for electoral peace and resulted in a century of Jim Crow, leaving deep wounds that are far from healed today. Now, why does this matter? This is not an offhand comment. This is an important observation by people who feel that the 1877 compromise, which, if I'm not mistaken, was the deal that was done to allow Rutherford B. Hayes to take the presidency. But basically, it was the trade there was an end to federal occupation of the South in exchange for electoral peace. And it's the view of these people that was a dark moment in American history where we took a wrong turn. And part of that dark moment is seen in the end of the common use of the Ku Klux Klan Act to effect social progress. Now, earlier this year, last year, in August of 2023, there was a guest essay in the New York Times, why it's no surprise that Trump is being charged under a Reconstruction-era law. It was written by Ian Basson and Christy Parker, who are the co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. These are the folks who were, at least Basson, was involved with the Transition Integrity Project. You'll also find that you'll also find that the Protect Democracy has been very outspoken in its public support of the recent lawsuits to try to get Donald Trump off the ballot in states like Colorado. They're not actually backing those lawsuits, or at least not that I could find. When I started entering the names of their lawyers in the PACER system, I found all kinds of interesting lawsuits, including one they reference here, but did not find that one. So, but what's interesting about this? This article talks about how they feel about the Ku Klux Klan Act. In 1871, with Klan violence continuing, Congress passed 2 more bills to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts. Among other things, these laws empowered citizens to sue anyone who conspired to intimidate or retaliate against them for exercising their political rights. Armed with these laws, the Justice Department oversaw the arrest and conviction of hundreds of Klansmen, and by 1873, the group had been effectively, though temporarily, crushed. While Section 241 has regularly been used ever since to police civil rights violations, and I've been to those cases, having covered a lot of police brutality cases and lawsuits. With an end of Reconstruction in 1877, Klan Act litigation brought by private parties declined precipitously, according to our research, until in recent years. In July 2017, our organization, Protect Democracy, filed a Klan Act lawsuit against the 2016 Trump campaign over what we asserted was its role in Russian efforts to compromise the political rights of Americans. Now, that lawsuit is this one. It's Cockrum, Comer, and Schoenberg versus Donald J. Trump for president. And it uses the Klan Act to argue, this is not a joke, uses the Klan Act to argue that Donald Trump conspired with Russian hackers to deprive, for instance, a DNC official like Scott Comer of his civil right to advocate for the candidate of his choice through the Russiagate scheme. So that was their vision for bringing back the Klan Act. Now, if you look, you'll find that the Klan Act is all over the place now. There have been lots and lots of Klan Act suits that have been followed. And I'm not going to comment generally on the justice or injustice of all of them. What I will say is that the use of the Klan Act as a tool of social change is something that they very, very much believe in. There are people who were attendees of January 6th whom I know who were hit with Klan Act lawsuits. They won. The one person that I know who in that situation who was hit with one of those suits, he won that suit. But a lot of people are facing these suits. Donald J. Trump is facing a Klan Act suit filed, I think, by Protect Democracy lawyers. But they have a vision that this is a very powerful tool. It's kind of like a social RICO. It's hard for me to understand. Maybe there's some lawyers in the audience who can explain it better for me. But basically, it's membership in a group that is conspiring to deprive any person of their civil rights. You can be sued civilly under this act. I believe there's also a criminal provision instead, as well. But this is I just wanted to make the point, and this is a separate subject that I'm going to have to do at another time. Once I started looking through PACER, I found all these different lawsuits. I'm only citing the most ridiculous one, which is the Comer suit, but there are lots and lots and lots of these Klan Act suits, and this is a not insignificant part of the landscape of modern America is the introduction of this as a political tool. All right, they go on. The concept of election night is no longer accurate and indeed is dangerous. Campaigns, parties, the press, and the public must be educated to adjust expectations starting immediately. Now, everybody remembers this. There were some pretty dramatic changes to the electoral landscape heading into the 2020 election. A lot of the requirements, the eligibility requirements for mail-in voting, for instance, were eliminated in a lot of states. So that meant a lot more mail-in ballots. So there was a huge, and I think unprecedented, media campaign to tell people, do not expect to get a result on election night. That still doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, I've had people explain it to me. I've had people who really believe in this strongly explain it to me, and I've also had it explained that in many cases it's Republicans who were obfuscating the idea of counting mail-in ballots on time or earlier. But this idea that in modern America, it's going to take us weeks to tally up mail-in votes, or that for whatever reason we need to allow people to postmark their votes on election days, so that we have to wait for it to go through the mail and then wait for it to be counted, and that we should no longer expect to get a result on election night. I find that suspicious, and I think that's it's part of this whole air of unreliability that surrounds modern American elections. We've had fiascos in multiple American elections, going back to especially 2016, 2020, the Iowa caucus. I think there was never even officially a result in Iowa. The New Hampshire primary, the New York mayoral race. But this is part of their strategy ahead of time. Condition people to not expect a result early. Okay, then they go on. We assess that there is a chance the president will attempt to convince legislatures and/or governors to take actions, including illegal actions, to defy the popular vote. Federal laws provide little guidance for how Congress should resolve irregularities when they convene in a joint session on January 6th, 2021. So they're already looking at January 6th. That was the only reason I highlighted that. Also, I highlighted this to point out that even they're saying that there are some ambiguities in the law about what happens in a contested election scenario. So anyway, going on. Even though the co-head of the TIP, Rosa Brooks, told me that this was not a set of plans, there were a lot of things in the TIP report that were just outright plans or recommendations. One of them was plan for a contested election. Approach this as a political battle, not just a legal battle. That's going to come up again later. Address the two biggest threats head on, lies about voter fraud and escalating violence. Voting fraud is virtually non-existent. That's, this is something that I read constantly, and it may be true, but it feels to me like one of those things that journalists just sort of take for granted without really looking into it. It's also interesting given, again, if you look at the challenges to no labels or Ralph Nader or the Green Party, you'll see the Democratic Party and in other frameworks, the Republican Party, they very much believe in fraud, and that's why, at least on paper, they believe that they have to challenge every single signature and every single ballot if it comes down to it. However, we're supposed to take on faith that their voting fraud is virtually non-existent. Also, by the way, historically, we know, for instance, that there were two states that were outright stolen in the 1960 American presidential election. The idea that it doesn't happen in America is ridiculous, and the idea that journalists shouldn't pay attention to this is, I think, it's also bogus. But they were told to do so. All right. About the Transition Integrity Project, This is just, again, more, we're being fair, we're being even-handed, but it's the Trump administration that may seek to manipulate, ignore, or undermine or disrupt the 2020 presidential election. TIP takes no position on how Americans should cast their votes or on the likely winner of the upcoming election. Either major party candidate could prevail in November without resorting to dirty tricks. However, the administration of President Donald Trump has steadily undermined core norms of democracy and the rule of law. So, that's actually what we're doing, is we're worried about Donald Trump. We're going to say that without saying it, or we're going to say both things. It's an odd document. This is an odd document in general because it's meant for public consumption. So some of it is messaging. Some of it is actually real recommendations that they're making to one another. But it's all worth reading. It's all interesting on multiple levels. All right. Trump has begun to lay the groundwork for potentially ignoring or disrupting the voting process. Similarly, he has frequently expressed the view that he is entitled to additional time in office and that his opponents are seeking to steal the election. What do we think this is? I mean, we've had nothing but propaganda suggesting that Donald Trump is going to steal the election, and this entire exercise is about Donald Trump stealing the election. So again, this is the first of what will turn into, as you'll see, many instances of psychological projection where they're saying, "Oh, well, he's going to do it," but what is the TIP? What is this report, if not a gigantic document expressing their fears that Donald Trump is going to try to steal the election? Then there's this. This is just funny. That TIP's concerns are widely shared is reflected in the media attention, which this project has already begun to garner. For a list of articles as of late July 2020, see Appendix A. I can show that to you. I'll show it to you later if you like. But basically, they got a ton of press coverage. I was not able to find out which PR firm was hired to make that happen, but I would put a fairly high amount of money on the notion that they hired a pretty good PR firm to make sure that they got all that coverage. They got placement in basically every major news organization in the country. The interviews with almost all the same people. It was very clear that the same people were doing the talking in almost every one of the articles. Very few of the articles broke the seal and actually did any reporting on people who were in the simulation but weren't named. The only one that I can really think of off the top of my head is the Boston Globe, which put Norm Eisen's name in the middle of this. But anyway, that's just interesting to point out that they're taking credit for how widely their concerns are shared in the form of all the press attention when they themselves basically instituted the press attention. Here's a little footnote. TIP recognizes and shares the view that the Electoral College is profoundly anti-democratic and that numerous long-standing practices also function to create structural biases in our voting system. For present purposes, however, these constraints are treated as givens. So they're telling us this I think is interesting. And it's interesting because it also comes up in the simulation. They want the Electoral College done away with. And for present purposes, for the purposes of this simulation, they will go along with the Electoral College. But as we'll see in the simulation, their contempt for at least the contempt of some for the Electoral College was such that they were actually moved to withdraw a concession speech. All right, this is a minor detail. 67 people participated as active players. There were roughly 33 others who were involved in some way or another. So there were 100 people. There are about a dozen who who have been named, who have come out and have been willing to let their names be used. But there's still a large number of people who have not been identified. The list that I've made, I've got about 30 probables, and I wasn't able to add in any more definites to the list. But I think it's an interesting thing to try to find out who else was involved in this exercise. We know that there are two fairly senior, currently serving people who were involved in the Transition Integrity Project. That's the current Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, former Michigan governor, and Podesta, who is basically overseeing a big slush money fund. There's a gigantic green energy fund who the disbursements for which he's in charge of as a special advisor to Joe Biden. So he's one of the more powerful people in Washington. Still, there are some other folks about whom I have pretty strong suspicions of being involved in this project, who, let's just say, I think are prominent in the national security universe, but we can't say that for sure, not yet. But it's interesting. All right, key insights from the scenario exercises. The one thing they kept pointing to as evidence that Donald Trump was going to violate norms is that the president deployed agents from Homeland Security to Portland to suppress the Black Lives Matter protests or the George Floyd protests. But that's really the one thing that they point to about violating norms. And we'll get to the fact that there are a lot of other norms that were violated that are much more serious and much more concerning and started much earlier, but they don't mention those. Okay. Trump also demanded that the election results be called immediately on election day, for example, before all mail-in ballots can be counted. And the Director of National Counterintelligence and Security Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued a statement warning that foreign countries are again trying to interfere in the U.S. elections. The former thing here is just they're counting the fact that Donald Trump thinks that votes should be counted on election day, which, hey, I'm not an expert, but I think they should be, certainly after COVID. But they're calling that evidence of, that he's not going to observe norms. And also this whole thing about intelligence officials warning that foreign countries are again trying to interfere in the U.S. election. Make a mental note of that, because they will later call that exact thing an example of the kind of abuse that Donald Trump could commit. This idea of raising fears of foreign interference. Litigation will be an important part of the strategy for both sides. Social media in particular will undoubtedly play a heavy role in how the public perceives the outcome of the election. Political operatives, both domestic and foreign, will very likely attempt to use social media to sow discord and even move people to violence. Social media companies' policy and enforcement decisions will be consequential, and this merits further exploration and consideration. All right, so what they're basically saying is that we need social media is unregulated, and there are going to be foreign actors who are going to try to sow discord. So we need to clamp down on that, and this was done. There was the Election Integrity Partnership, which was a project that involved 4 non-governmental agencies and at least 2 governmental agencies: the Department of Homeland Security, specifically CISA, and the Global Engagement Center. And the Election Integrity Partnership, for everybody who is familiar with the Twitter files, they put out a report called The Long Fuse, You can read it yourself, and you'll see that 72% of the flags that they said, or I think, or maybe it was not the flags, maybe it was the disinformation events that they identified were on the theme of what they call delegitimization. So it's not unreasonable to assume that the DHS and the Global Engagement Center, and why the Global Engagement Center, which is a State Department organization, its remit is foreign diplomacy, why they're doing anything at all in the domestic arena involving domestic speech, how that's permitted is just beyond me. I don't understand. Anyway, it's not. I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that the primary focus of the EIP and some other programs like it was this question of delegitimization. Let's make sure that there's not a lot of content on social media that raises questions about the legitimacy of the election result. I found actually there is an organization that's tangentially connected to Protect Democracy that did some agitation on this issue, on the election integrity issue, and they had sample tweets already prepared within a day or two after the election, talking about how, you know, there have been no irregularities, there's no legitimate claim to election fraud, et cetera, et cetera. These messages got more strident with time, but it's worth pointing out that they had a bureaucratic infrastructure in place, not only to suppress private complaints or the complaints of people in public life about questioning the election, but that they also had a very strong public messaging campaign set up. All right, moving forward. This is just about, well, this is interesting. Okay. Team Trump immediately adopted a strategy of casting doubt on the official election results, and that did happen. Even in the one scenario where he later accepted a loss. That's interesting because that's what the Democrats did in 2016. Team Trump also encouraged chaos and violence in the streets and aimed to provoke Team Biden into subverting norms, even as Team Trump itself sabotaged traditional norms, so that Team Biden could be accused of hypocrisy or illegality. So this is setting us up, or setting reporters up, to say, oh my goodness, these accusations of hypocrisy or of illiberalism on the part of Team Biden, this was all part of Team Trump's plan from the beginning. Again, this is all supposed to be theoretical, but this was put out there for public consumption. It was put out there, among other things, especially for reporters to read. So they're taking all this stuff in. It's just worth noting. All right. Just making sure. Is this interesting to people? Am I going on and on too much about this? Just wanted to make sure. Okay, because we've got a few more things I want to get to. In Tip's exercise, when Team Trump was behind in the popular vote, they moved quickly to try to shift the narrative and alter the standards of proof. So that's very interesting also, because if you go back and look at the entire history of the Trump era, you'll see that whenever something bad happened, there was a lot of narrative shifting that went on, but it was very, very rarely an organized thing in the part of the Trump side. That did happen from Trump, but this was much more sort of massaging narratives when bad things happened. I think the most classic example is we lost the election and let's have a confab about it and come out within 24 hours blaming Jim Comey and Russia. that's an example of some of the kind of thing that we know happened on the other side, for sure. But they're projecting that as a fear that Trump would do it. This is an important thing. They mentioned this a couple of times. Team Biden generally felt constrained by a commitment to norms and a desire to tamp down violence and reduce instability. They will mention this over and over again. Well, I'll talk in a moment about what I think that means. Here we go. As an incumbent unbounded by norms, President Trump has a huge advantage. All right. And I will, let's see, where is the punchline to that? Okay. Here it is. Planners need to take seriously the notion that this may well be a street fight, and our reliance on elites observing norms are not the answer here. So, just take all these pieces of information, put them together. Team Biden felt constrained by the commitment to norms. Our own sense of decency is what's going to cause us to lose. As an incumbent unbounded by norms, President Trump has a huge advantage. He's going to break the rules, and that's going to help him win. So they go on to conclude that reliance on norms is not the way to go. What's the exact word phrasing here? It's so interesting. Or reliance on elites observing norms are not the answer here. So that's just saying outright that, look, if this thing turns out to be a jump ball, we have to be on equal competitive ground with Trump. We got to be willing to break the rules just as much as he is, and that's just the way it goes. I thought that reliance on elites observing norms is not the way to go. I thought that was the key line in the entire report. I asked the co-founder Niels Gilman about it. You can see his response in the article. Basically, he points out that the Republicans, 2/3 of the caucus voted not to. I think it was they didn't want to punish the Trump for the January 6th insurrection, or they went along with stop the steal in some way, and that makes sense on the surface. But the other interesting thing about that is that the other co-founder, Rosa Brooks, she wrote an article in early 2017 called basically, I think it was like 3 ways to get rid of Trump before 2020. And one of them was impeachment. And there's a line in there about how, the good news is that high crimes and misdemeanors can be basically anything. And, you don't even need evidence. And when I asked her about that, I said, that seems kind of crazy to me. That seems like I'm not a lawyer, but that seems like it violates the spirit of the constitutional provision. She replied, well, the precedent is very clear that impeachment is primarily a political remedy. So there's nothing wrong with, a week into the presidential administration, because she published her article on January 30th of 2017. There's nothing wrong with talking about impeachment, talking about impeaching for anything, saying that high crimes and misdemeanors can be just about anything, and saying that evidence is not particularly relevant because this is primarily a political remedy. So it's okay in that circumstance, but when Republicans behave in a political way, when they don't put their civic duty in front of their political aims, then that's a grave threat to the republic. I just think that there's some hypocrisy here. They always want to pretend that they're taking the high ground when they're really not. All right. Now, this is the key section to the whole report, this page 8. And I went through a lot of this already in the piece, so I won't bore people with it, but it talks about all the things that presidents can do to put their thumb on the scale. Tip scenario exercise underscored a basic truth. An incumbent running for re-election can use the powers of the presidency to great advantage, particularly if traditional norms are viewed as unimportant, and the incumbent is willing to take the risk that a court will eventually rule his actions to be unlawful. The exercise identified the following presidential powers as most likely to be misused to manipulate electoral outcomes or disrupt the transition. And they just list all the stuff that happened after 2016, or even before 2016. 1, the president's ability to launch. Now here again, they talk about the president's ability to federalize the National Guard. That's the one thing they can actually point to is the sort of the Portland situation. But after that, every single one of these things is stuff that happened to the Trump administration. The president's ability to launch investigations into opponents. This is before all the Jack Smith stuff, although they do make reference to potential prosecution by Letitia James or the state of New York. But as mentioned in the piece, Donald Trump was under federal investigation for absolute bullshit months before the election. The Crossfire Hurricane FBI probe was officially launched on July 31st of 2016, but it clearly began far earlier than that because there were informants who were sent after people like George Papadopoulos. Stefan Halper was already looking at people in the Trump campaign well before the July 31st date. And even though the Inspector General's report by Michael Horowitz ruled that it wasn't technically illegal, the launching of that campaign, that report, that Horowitz report, doesn't say a whole lot of nice things about that investigation and about what it was all about. They never really had anything. And as we know from testimony, and I've talked about this before, by August of 2016, they basically knew that collusion was a dead end, that the Papadopoulos thing was a dead end, and that's why they moved on to Carter Page to try to find some other avenue to investigate. So they knew within a month that this was a bogus investigation, and they went on and continued to investigate anyway. Anyway, going on. His ability to use the Department of Justice and or the intelligence agencies to cast doubt on the election results. This happened before Donald Trump was even elected. Remember, it was a talking point in the debates with Hillary Clinton. She brought up the 17 intelligence agencies who were all in agreement, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that was erroneous. It turned out to be not 17 agencies, but 3. And then upon closer examination, it was really one agency. It was really all John Brennan, who handpicked the team. And the source for the conclusion that this was done on behalf of Donald Trump is basically one source who was communicating directly with Brennan. But anyway, this idea of the intelligence agencies casting doubt on the election results, this was a fundamental aspect of the Trump presidency. It continued through the Trump presidency. It was also part of the intelligence assessment released on January 6th, 2017. So, using the intelligence agencies to cast doubt on the election results or discredit opponents, again, it was done before Trump was even elected. Referencing classified documents without releasing them. Now, what does that sound like? There were constant references in the 3 years after Trump was elected to things the public was not actually allowed to see. I think the most classic example is the FISA warrant on Carter Page, which was reported as this overwhelming evidence that one of Trump's former aides was an agent of a foreign power. Actually, if the public had gotten a look at that FISA warrant, they would have seen that it was based on bogus intelligence, that it was based on stuff from the Steele dossier, that whoever put that warrant application together was double counting evidence. This was exonerating material, but the public wasn't seeing the actual source documentation, wasn't seeing that. So they were led to believe that there was all kinds of stuff out there that, that was really incriminating, when in fact it was the opposite. All right, manipulating classified information or selectively releasing classified documents for political purposes, fueling manufactured rumors. I went over this in the piece, but they, obviously did this. There were lots of classified documents and classified information that was selectively released, including the phone conversations between Michael Flynn and Sergei Kislyak. The ability to freeze assets of individuals and groups the president determines to be a threat. Again, we've seen that from other politicians. It's, I think, probably most famously done by Justin Trudeau. There's a little bit of asset forfeiture was done in the Mueller investigations. But it's and there was a lot of freezing of assets and elimination of ability to use payment services of people who were still on trial for January 6th offenses. So this is a clear stratagem of the intelligence services and the enforcement agencies. But again, it's being attributed as something that Donald Trump might do to them. The ability to restrict internet communications in the name of national security. Again, went over that in the piece, but that's just laughable. If you follow the racket, we spent all year last year talking about all the different organizations that were created to suppress information and to restrict communications in the name of national security, and were highly politicized. So I think people know what they mean when they talk about that. But it's very interesting that they would worry that that's something that could be done to them. Many participants expressed concern that the Department of Justice has been politicized and would be used to provide legal cover for the president's actions. The elections also demonstrated that there is considerable room to use foreign interference, real or invented, as a pretext to cast doubt on the election results, or more generally to create uncertainty about the illegitimacy of the election. Not to beat a dead horse, but this was a constant of pre-election agitation in 2020. So, and I linked to a lot of articles in the piece. There, you can find as many of them as you want. You could probably find 100, 200 articles, and that's not even including the television coverage. But the constant reminders that the Russians are going to mess with the election results, that happened after 2016. It happened before 2018. It happened before 2020. In both 2018 and 2020, as soon as the results came in and Democrats won, we heard stories saying the exact opposite. All right. GOP elected officials in the exercises were most often acted in lockstep to support Team Trump. Where the GOP broke ranks, it could be decisive. I'm not sure why I flagged that. I think, you know, they were overestimating the monolithic nature of the Republican caucus, but whatever. Then there's this whole thing, and this is where a lot of the color. When I'm coming to the end, I'm not going to make you go through the entire thing for folks, but there was a lot of talk about the role of social justice activists and people who might be encouraged to go out in the street. As a practical matter, however, participants in the exercise noted that racial justice activists and others will likely act independently of the Biden campaign. Players repeatedly cautioned that these social movements are independent, not beholden to or a tool of the Democratic Party. Here, again, I need to caution folks that this is both a public messaging document and an actual report. So are they saying that so that people will actually think it, or is that something that they were really worried about, that they can't rely on certain groups to go out on the streets on command? If anything, the scale of recent demonstrations has increased the stakes for the Democratic Party to build strong ties with grassroots organizations and be responsive to the movement's demands. So they're saying, we need to be able to get these people out in the street. All right, President Trump and his more fervent supporters have every incentive to try to turn peaceful pro-Biden or anti-Trump protests violent in order to generate evidence that a Democratic victory is tantamount to mob rule. And again, reading that phrase, it's just a dead giveaway. How many times have we read about pro-Trump demonstrations? And this is even before January 6th, but particularly since January 6th, articles about Trump and mob rule have been constant. They are all over the place. And again, so they're talking about this is something that's going to happen in the other direction. Maybe so, it's possible, but it certainly happened the other way too. Trump can rely on surrogates to embed operatives inside protests to encourage violent action. Now that one I haven't really heard of yet. Have we? Do we have evidence of a Trump embedded person inside Antifa or something like that, leading them to, I don't know. I mean, it's possible, but we certainly know the other thing has happened. And he can mobilize a range of law enforcement actors, including the National Guard troops, whether federalized or under the control of GOP governors, who might, without proper training or if led by politicized actors, escalate matters. That line about without proper training or if led by politicized actors is really interesting, because when I asked these folks about the color revolution scenario and why they laughed about it so much when certainly Michelle Goldberg thought it was a serious thing in the New York Times, and it's not silly to think about this. There's a lot of stuff in this report that sounds an awful lot like everything that anybody who's ever read a think tank analysis of a color revolution. It sounds like exactly the same stuff, and particularly with Norm Eisen involved in this thing, it's not silly. When I talked to or when I texted with Rosa Brooks, the co-founder, she had this really interesting response to that question, basically saying that you know, there are. She was talking about how, yes, sustained peaceful protests are a constitutional right, and I was asking, what were the people in the TIP, were they recommending this idea of using sustained protests as a way to, as part of an element, to overturn a result? Were they suggesting that only in the element of Trump stealing an election, or were there other scenarios where that might be desirable? And the reason I asked that is because, and I pointed this out to her, I said, because in some of the color revolutions, we've assisted revolutions that overturn legally elected leaders who may not have been the best people in the world, but they were legally elected. And her answer was that, you know, in every group of protesters, and I'll look for the exact language, there are always provocateurs and people who will try to incite violence to make people look bad. It's an interesting answer. I think people can probably catch my drift between the lines, but there's a hint here about how, you know, they're already, even on Trump's behalf here, they're sort of saying, well, things might get out of hand because certain law enforcement actors who are badly trained might escalate matters. I don't know. What does that sound like to you? It sounds a little fishy to me. All right, wag the dog, spark a foreign adventure. There was quite a bit of speculation that Trump might himself initiate a foreign crisis shortly after the election or during the transition, perhaps to change the media narrative around a contested election, attempt to rally nationalist feelings to himself. Does that sound like David Frum and Bill Kristol were key players in this simulation? If I'm not mistaken, I think Max Boot even played Trump. Does this sound like a neoconservative thought process, or does it sound like a Donald Trump thought process? Just spitballing here. How many times have we had wag the dog military adventures in recent years, and who's done them? You know, I think you can do the math on that. Disrupt the transition process. In a debrief, one participant expressed concern that Attorney General Barr could launch a bogus investigation into terrorist ties of the Biden transition team in order to justify surveillance. Again, we've had a huge domestic violent extremism investigation. This predates January 6th. We had a bogus national security investigation involving Trump and Russia that was used to justify surveillance of a number of figures. But they're worried that Barr will do it. Okay, but think about it for a moment. Just a few more. Plan for a contested election. Again, there will not be an election night this year. This will almost certainly delay the certified result for days or weeks. We're supposed to be cool with that. Planners need to be, and I've already talked about this, reliance on elite observing norms is not the answer. The news media has a particular responsibility, basically, to tell them to report whatever we tell them to ready the public for the possibility that results will not be known on election night, to communicate election results accurately, and to plan to cover a contested election in a manner that reduces rather than inflames tensions. I'm not a Trump supporter, but there's a lot of stuff about the last election that raises questions for me. I don't know how this stuff works. I don't know how necessary these delays were. Why am I being told that I have a responsibility to not do that job? Why am I being told that I have a responsibility to not say something that I actually thought on election night. Man, that's weird that, you know, the results looked one way when I went to sleep and they were another way when I woke up. Now, I haven't seen any evidence at all of actual vote changing. Anything that would, for me, that would qualify as hard evidence. The closest thing to that is the disparity between the presidential election results and the congressional results. But journalists, telling journalists to not ask those questions is strange, but it's also revealing because it tells you how both journalists and these people view the press, which is that we're on the side of accomplishing a political result, and this is the political result we want. We want to reduce tensions. We want people to feel confident in the result, assuming it's the right one. All right. Everyone, particularly the media and nonpartisan actors, should avoid both sidesism, the instinct to appear neutral by positing false equivalencies between major and minor norm breaches or illegalities. I mean, this I think is interesting because this is just one of those inadvertently revealing things where they actually think this. I feel more than confident that having dealt with enough of these folks over the years, that they actually think that that it's a false equivalency to talk about norms violations when committed by people who are opposing Donald Trump, as opposed to norms violations committed by Donald Trump. So if I talk about illegal leaks of classified information, if we talk about the incredible events of the first couple of weeks of 2017, when James Comey, John Brennan, and James Clapper, and the NSA head, I think it was Rogers, they get together and they contrive to have this meeting with Trump so that they can present him with material about that contains Steele dossier information, ostensibly to warn him about potential blackmail. Then it's immediately leaked to put an awesome amount of pressure on the incoming president, in conjunction with similar kinds of leaks around the world to the effect of foreign countries shouldn't share intelligence with us because we think the president might be subject to leverages of pressure. That is deeply disturbing, unpatriotic behavior. If I were the president, I would have fired every one of those folks on the spot for even trying that kind of thing. The instant I saw that stuff appear in the news, I would have fired everybody. And we're supposed to say that that's not a serious breach of norms for the heads of intelligence agencies to leak that kind of a thing at the beginning of a presidential administration. Just unbelievable. All right, of particular concern: president's ability to launch investigations and freeze assets, control communication in the name of national security. We've already gone over that. And here's the appendix of all the press coverage that they got. Game 2, clear Biden victory. Game 3, clear Trump win. And this is the one where the Biden campaign encouraged Western states, particularly California, but also Oregon and Washington, and collectively known as Cascadia, to secede from the union unless congressional Republicans agreed to a set of structural reforms to fix our democratic system to ensure majority rule. With advice from President Obama, the Biden campaign submitted a proposal to, one, give statehood to Washington, blah, 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 eliminate the electoral college to ensure that the candidate who wins the popular vote becomes president. So, yeah, this is what John Podesta did, playing a losing Joe Biden in a simulation in 2020. It may not be an actual plot, but it certainly gives some insight into where the mindset of these particular folks. And there's more in here. I didn't want to go through all of it because it would take too much time. But it gives you a flavor of the kinds of stuff, the kind of stuff that's in here. You will find lots of things that are just examples of them worrying about things that they've done being done to them. Now, the last thing I want to talk about just quickly is this. And this is the letter that was sent by some pretty prominent folks. Now, I have to point this out. Here are the 5 signatories to the letter that was sent to the Department of Justice on behalf of the No Labels third-party movement. And just to be clear, I don't care. I don't have any particular feelings about No Labels as a political entity. Just as in this context, I don't particularly care about the politics of Donald Trump. This is all about whether or not somebody is being allowed, their right to appear on a ballot. And so far, we've been told that the efforts to try to clean up the ballots and get Donald Trump off the ballot, well, that's because he's an insurrectionist, and the Constitution is very clear on that, and we can't have that. Never mind that he's the front runner in the poll, and that normally we would think of, of any leader that tries to disqualify their main political opponent from appearing in an election, we would normally think that is an authoritarian move. But with Trump, people buy it because it's Donald Trump, and because, look, January 6th happened, and people have some very strong feelings about it. I personally don't think it rises to the level of, of a crime, or if they are going to use it to disqualify him, I think they need to criminally charge him with the act and have him convicted and then do it. At which point I'd have no problem with it. But that's not what they're doing. Anyway, forget about all of that. The No Labels political party is seeking to create an alternative. And here are some of the people who are signing this letter. Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who, if I am not mistaken, is the former head of the NAACP. Senator Joseph Lieberman, who is the former senator of Connecticut, who's a former vice presidential candidate. I've covered his campaign, and I can't not mention this. Lieberman provided me with one of the all-time funniest moments I've ever seen on the campaign trail, which is that he used to introduce himself using the Rolling Stones song "Start Me Up," not aware that the closing line in that song is "You'd make a dead man come." So he would be up there smiling and glide-handing people as that was happening. Anyway, Dennis Blair, talk about people from the intelligence world. This is the former director of national intelligence. Then there's Pat McCrory, who's a former governor of North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. And Dan Webb, I forget what his former role was. Hang on a second. But this is a serious group of people. Normally we're not talking about Joe Lieberman and the former head of the NAACP as fringe characters, right? They send the letter to the Justice Department, and they use incredibly strong language. They say that they've been subject to a highly coordinated, conspiratorial, partisan, and often unlawful conspiracy. These activities violate federal criminal law, including the RICO statute and a number of criminal civil rights provisions, not to mention freedom of association rights, blah, blah, blah. They reference, and I mentioned this in the article, a story that was in Semaphore about a meeting of various kind of left liberal advocacy organizations, including, I believe, Move On and American Bridge. I forget who some of the others were. But they sort of issued a general warning to anybody. Oh, by the way, Bill Kristol was there. Transition Integrity Project participant Bill Kristol. Dimitri Melhorn, who is the kind of hatchet man for Reid Hoffman. Senator Doug Jones, who was the recipient of the largesse of Reid Hoffman's little Project Alabama scheme, but perhaps innocently, who knows? Anyway, in a Zoom meeting, an unidentified person gets up and sort of addresses anybody who would think about running on a no labels ticket. Through every channel that we have, to their donors, their friends, the press, everyone should send the message. If you have one fingernail clipping of a skeleton in your closet, we will find it. If you think you were vetted when you ran for governor, you're insane. That was nothing. We're going to come at you with every gun we can possibly find. And it actually gets worse somewhere. If you get involved with this, you're really risking your entire reputation and your legacy, blah, blah, blah. Then it talks about other things that went on. And there was just one thing that I wanted to mention. On June 28th, 2023, Move On Political Action sent letters to 49 secretaries of state encouraging them to follow the lead of the Maine Secretary of State and investigate no labels. The organization noted on its website, Move On Political Action is sending a letter to all secretaries of state to urge election officials to investigate no labels electoral activities as the dark money group attempts to qualify to appear on the ballot in all 50 states. The letter cited no evidence whatsoever of any wrongdoing by no labels. And if you want to look and see what that letter looks like, this is it. Or there's a story about it. But, and this is where I'm going to end. All of this sort of leads us to one basic contention. In addition to the challenges to Trump being on the ballot, which are going to be resolved by the Supreme Court, hopefully, we have sort of unprecedented stuff going on in the areas of technical challenges to third-party candidates. So there's an enormous amount of money already deployed, millions of dollars, to challenge no labels, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., anybody who might appear on the no labels ticket, Cornel West, Dr. Cornel West. There's already been unprecedented efforts to make sure that people like Dean Phillips or Marianne Williamson, but particularly Dean Phillips, who I actually saw getting some coverage today, to make sure that they're not relevant in the political season, in the primary season. You know, they've canceled the Florida primary. They disallowed the New Hampshire results, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, somebody's asking, isn't no labels mostly Koch billionaire bucks? I don't know. Who cares? It doesn't matter. That's kind of the whole point. Like, it's a bunch of people who want to get a ballot line, and as you know, if you want to read the Grand Illusion, the story about Ralph Nader, it's an extremely difficult thing to do to get on the ballot in all 50 states. It's a big accomplishment to even get to a theoretical 270 electoral votes. So, 30 states, 35 states. Somebody wants to spend a whole lot of money to hire a bunch of people to go canvass and get signatures. All power to them. I think I'm all for those ballot lines existing so that they can go ahead and maybe make a deal with somebody at some point to post a candidate who might be real opposition to some of these parties, particularly now, since both the Democrats and the Republicans are kind of have historically high negatives. But there is a comprehensive effort to make sure that neither intramural challenges within the Democratic Party nor third-party challenges, nor the Republican frontrunner appear in the ballot. This is in addition to the criminal indictments of the Republican frontrunner. We've just never seen anything like this before. You have to take this all as a piece and understand that these so-called loose-knit Zooming groups. One of the things about these people, by the way, is that they have an addiction to getting together and plotting and then talking to journalists about it, which is kind of funny. But this stuff is happening, and it's resulting in an election that is going to be decided by lawyers instead of voters. And it's a major story. We've never seen anything like this before. I think we all should have paid attention a little bit more in 2004 in particular, when there was such an intense effort to keep Nader off the ballot. But now we can go back and look at those tactics and say, yeah, all those challenges that they spent so much money on and so much time and effort on, they were now they've gone big league. This is them going pro, and it's the story of the campaign so far, I think. Anyway, thanks to everybody for tuning out. If you have any questions, please write into Racket. Put them in the comments of either this piece or of the Racket pieces, and I'll address them one way or the other. But I really appreciate everybody coming out and going through this document with me. I think it was interesting, and there are lots and lots of rabbit holes to get to with all this. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get to even a fraction of it in the piece, but thanks to everybody for tuning in. All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend, and talk to you soon.